So I want to just tell you a little bit about sort of general apologetics. Please forgive me if I'm teaching you stuff that you know. As I'm sure you're all aware, apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which is to give a reason, a defense, an answer for what we believe. And the verse that Jeff read out, that 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the hope that you have. That kind of underpins what apologetics is. And it's really the kind of tricky questions of faith. So things that, if we're honest, we'd much rather not answer. So things like suffering, God and science, is there any evidence? And I think I certainly had a tendency to think of apologetics as for geeky, middle-aged men that just were discussing unimportant issues. Not that there's anything wrong with middle-aged men, I hasten to add, just all the apologetics they all sort of seemed slightly out of touch with culture and things like that. But actually, the more I've looked into apologetics, the more I've realised that it totally is to speak into the culture. That's kind of the point of it. The tagline for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, who I work for, is helping the thinker believe and the believer think. And I think that's a really helpful way of thinking of apologetics. Yes, it's for the believer to think about what they believe, and actually once they've kind of thought about those things, to then help share their faith more helpfully. But it's also for the thinker to believe. It's also to kind of help almost in that pre-evangelism of kind of helping to clear up some of those head issues. There's an apologist called David Geisler who says, "I'm troubled that far too many of those who are skilled in the area of Christian apologetics don't seem to have a deep burden for reaching the lost." And I think the lost is exactly why we do apologetics. And you don't have to look around very far to see how lost our generation is. Jesus' last words to his disciples were evangelism. If you look at the end of Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew 28:19, it says, "Go and make disciples of all of the nations." And then if you look at kind of the equivalent passage in Acts 1, verse 8, it says, "You will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And Father Vincent J. Donovan, who was a missionary among the Maasai tribe in Tanzania, says this, that mission is the meaning of the church. He says, "The church exists only insofar as it carries Christ into the world. The idea of church without mission is an absurdity." And I think it's obvious from Jesus' words and the sort of wealth of church history that this is not just a task for those professional missionaries like Father Donovan. It's very much the call of all Christians, whether we like it or not. And Donald Miller, in a book called Blue Like Jazz, which is a brilliant kind of characteristic of our culture, if you want a book that sort of sums up what our culture's like, he says this: if we are not introducing people to Jesus, then we don't think he's an important person. And that really challenged me. Does the life of our congregations imply that Jesus is an important person? I think that's quite an interesting question. So we're all called to be evangelists. We're all called to be salt and light in our classrooms, in our workplaces, in our friendship groups. And I think as well as a lot of us assuming that mission is just for the professional missionaries, I think we have a tendency to think that actually it's only necessary overseas. So I'm on our deanery synod, and we were having a discussion in little small groups about what mission meant. And it really surprised me to see that everyone was talking about mission in an overseas context. It kind of hadn't occurred to anyone to think about mission in our own communities. How do we do mission in our own communities? But I think it's really important that we do. Pete Gregg and Andy Freeman have written a book called Punk Monk. And in it, they say that Jesus has sent us across our streets just as much as he has sent us across the seas. I think where we live really matters. The location of our parish is significant. I think it's really important that we do mission within our context and within the culture. And actually, that's probably going to be different for all of you. Just chatting to some of you before, there's quite a kind of diverse mixture of different contexts and different cultures, even within the one diocese. The missionary who I quoted earlier, Father Donovan, says this: "Salvation history is radically local. God offers salvation through the specificity and the concreteness of culture." So God works in the specifics of culture. I think it's really important that we learn as much as we can about our culture in order to work out how we reach them. So what does our culture kind of look like? Well, a 2007 Tear Fund report suggested that over 70% of the UK population have no intention of ever attending a church service. which is a lot higher than I expected. Graham Tomlin, in his book, The Provocative Church, cites some statistics that say in Northern America and Western Europe, every Sunday, 53,000 people leave the church. Every Sunday in Western Europe and North America, 53,000 people leave the church. And even the number of church weddings, church funerals and baptisms are decreasing. I'm sure lots of you have read the document Mission-Shaped Church, which the Church of England released in 2004. And in that it says, mainstream culture no longer brings people to the church door. The pool of people who regard church as relevant or important is decreasing with every generation. So things potentially not looking good in our churches, and I wonder if that's because people view our churches as no longer relevant or credible. I don't know how many of you have read John Humphrey's, the Radio 4 broadcaster's book, In God We Doubt. There's a bit in the book where he says that churches are in decline because of thin services, banal choruses, poor preaching, and unfriendly people. I mean, he's probably not been to loads and loads of churches, but I think that is a bit of a wake-up call, actually. Do our churches look like that? But I think it's probably not just down to the churches, because, let's face it, 70% of people have never set foot in a church, if those statistics are right. So actually, a lot of it might be because of unpleasant experiences that they've had with Christians. Josh McDowell, who is an apologist, says this: "We live in a culture that is generally uninterested in the truth of the gospel, partly because they're thoroughly unimpressed by the people that proclaim it." And I think, if I'm a representative for Christ, if someone hasn't been to church and their only reference point is me, I've probably done an awful job, and quite frankly, they would be unimpressed with the gospel. So I think that's quite a challenging thing as well. I think for a lot of people, they think that Christians aren't relevant, they're behind the times. I don't know how many of you have read Francis Spufford's book, Unapologetic. He kind of satirises what people think of Christians, and he says, "We get all snooty and yuck no thanks about transsexuals, but think it's perfectly normal for middle-aged men to wear purple dresses." He says that people think that Christians are stuck in the past, and that believers are people with pudding bowl haircuts, wearing anoraks in August, and chunky knit sweaters the colour of vomit. So if that's what people think Christians are, and if that's all that people think Christians are, we've got a lot of work on our hands. So let's have a look at culture, because I think before we can engage with culture or re-engage with culture, we need to have a good hard look at it. I'm going to be taking some information from the Mission-Shaped Church document, but some of it is purely my opinion, so please feel free to disagree with me. It's just my view of how I see culture. So I think one of the major things is that we have become increasingly a consumer culture. We are information saturated constantly. There's so much information being thrown at us from all sorts of means, and we're constantly switched on. We never seem to be able to stop. We're always on our phone or always on our tablets, just constantly switched on, always looking for a new stimulation, something that's going to get us excited. And we're all in danger we're all sort of desperately trying to avoid FOMO. Does anyone know what FOMO is? Fear of missing out. Very good. We're all desperate not to miss out on whatever's going around us. I think we're a fragmented society. So the Mission-Shaped Church document talks about the fact that people will travel miles and miles to see people that they already know, rather than kind of making contact with the people in their locality. I think that's particularly true of big cities. So I know that for myself, it probably was about 5 years of me being in London in various different houses before I actually met my neighbours, which is not saying anything bad about them, it's completely my fault, but I think that seems to be quite true of a lot of cities. We're fragmented in that we connect with other people and not with the people around us, and kind of linked in with that, we've become a bit of a network society where location and geography doesn't necessarily matter. We're kind of connecting through networks online or through networks of people that have similar interests to us, and not so much the people that live on our front doors. So sort of at the same time, we're fragmenting and connecting. I think we are a massively comparison generation. I think particularly among young people, never before have we been able to look over our neighbour's fence in the same way that we can with, say, things like social media. Facebook has kind of made it legitimate to stalk people, and I think that's kind of led to to us putting forward false perceptions of ourselves. Again, I think particularly on social media, where you can be whoever you want to be on your profile, and actually we put on our party face, our game face, our perfectly painted exterior, and actually what we're doing is we're covering up our weaknesses, our faults, and we're putting something fake. And I think particularly with teenagers, and actually that's a really unhelpful thing, I think. In the midst of all of this busyness, our culture has become really time poor, and we've got very limited attention spans. I think we are in danger of losing a whole generation if we don't learn how to kind of distill the gospel into 140 characters. But how on earth do we do that without missing out huge chunks of the important stuff? I think we've moved from sort of organised religion to kind of a spirituality where the mystical and the experiential is sort of more important than the rational. But having said that, we've then got the new atheists who give us the kind of rational, intellectual arguments for there being no God. But twinned with that, you've got the kind of emotional reasons for there being no God, so Stephen Fry and suffering, which I don't know if any of you saw the clip that he did, but that was all over my Facebook. All of my friends were like, yes, what a good man. And I just thought, wow, he really is kind of encapturing what our nation thinks about these things. And with the rise of new atheism, you've got this negative view of religion and the kind of fear of extremism. And then we've got, with the rise of other religions, I think particularly in our country, you've got a move towards pluralism and relativism. I was talking to someone earlier about the fact that lots of people today just don't believe in any sort of objective truth. There's no right, there's no wrong, it's my opinion and your opinion, and actually, we need to have freedom of speech, and my opinion is just as valid as your opinion. Theology professor Howard Hendricks says that in a post-Christian world, not only is preference personal, but it's a constantly changing preference. I think that's quite interesting. And then if there is a God, then there's the sense that actually we all believe the same God. So I think this is epitomised in a quote from Madonna, who says, "I go to the synagogue, I study Hinduism, all paths lead to God." I think if there is a God, that's very much the God that most people believe in. A lot of my generation think that they're much more tolerant and open-minded than Christians are, or than the church is, over kind of ethical and moral issues. So that means that they then see the church as behind the times and intolerant and, quite frankly, mean. But I think the most sort of definitive thing about our generation is like Bishop Roger referred to, the lack of Christian knowledge. I think from what you've all said this morning, just talking to you, it's true for Essex, but I think it's also true for a lot of our country. There is a lack of Christian knowledge. Douglas Copeland, who is a Canadian novelist and artist, says that this is the first generation to have grown up without any sense of God at all. And I was helping how old was he? He's about 15, really, really clever kid, goes to a mega posh school. I was helping him with his RE homework, and there was a question about different types of baptism. And I just said to him, "Have you covered this in your RE class?" And he turned to me and said, "Is baptism the one with water?" And to my shame, I had to suppress a giggle, because who doesn't know what baptism is? But then I was like, do you know what? He's not from a Christian family. He's never set foot in a church. He doesn't go to a Christian school. Why would he know what baptism is? And actually, I think that's what we're dealing with. For a lot of particularly the young people in our culture, they've probably never even met a Christian, let alone set foot in a church. David Kinnaman has written a book called You Lost Me, all about this kind of loss of the teenage generation. And in the book, he says, it's not that they're not listening to us, it's that they can't understand what we're saying. The problem is when we're kind of in a society that's totally not for their own fault, biblically illiterate. So when we use words like guilt and faith and religion and God, they honestly have no idea what we're talking about. I think that's kind of epitomised in the fact that the word sin has come to mean kind of naughty and guilty pleasure. It's linked to like sexy lingerie and indulgent chocolates. And I think, if we use the word sin when we're talking about the gospel, we're in grave danger of belittling what happened at the cross, because we're speaking at completely cross purposes. I think we can't underestimate the authority and the influence that media has on this generation. Obviously, I'm biased, I worked in the media. But I think it does have a huge influence as a social commentator, regardless of what kind of pockets of culture we're living in. And I think in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago, actually, whether we like it or not, social media has become a huge part of that social commentary. digital media and technology, I guess, used to be something that we would kind of occasionally browse and use, but now it's become such an embedded, integral part of a lot of our lives, particularly our young people. You will never see a young person without an Instagram account or a Twitter account. Our young people are digital natives. While we had to kind of actively learn how to use these things, our young people grew up with Facebook, with Twitter, with computer games, with tablets, with a phone attached to their hand. I've got a little goddaughter, and we went to a museum recently, and they had a kind of screen just telling you what was going on. And it was one of those screens that wasn't touchscreen, and she kept sort of tapping it and swiping it, and I just thought she sort of inherently knows how to use these things. Our young people are digital natives. At the start of 2015, Facebook had 1.44 billion monthly active users. Active users, they're people that use it all the time, 1.44 billion. And WhatsApp, which relatively speaking is quite a kind of new emerger on the social media market, in the same time, beginning of 2015, 800 million active users. Christmas 2011, Angry Birds, which is a game for tablet, and I've got some nods in the room. It's a game for tablet and phones. I don't really know what you do, you sort of throw birds at things. Anyway, Christmas 2011, it was downloaded 6.5 million times. You kind of think on Christmas Day people have got something a little bit better to do than download a game 6.5 million times. A study in 2010 said that teenagers spend more than 7.5 hours a day consuming media. And that was 5 years ago, so it's probably gone up quite a lot since then, but 7.5 hours a day consuming media. Technology has kind of given us, but particularly our young people, unlimited access to other people's ideas and worldviews, which means that even the smallest of children have probably come into contact with kind of skeptical atheism online. And I think the terrifying is that because there's no sort of filter of whether the information is right or wrong, our young people are just kind of blindly accepting some of this stuff that is just nonsense, quite frankly. The Protestant Reformation is sort of widely acknowledged as not having... The 16th century printing press was absolutely instrumental in kind of helping the Protestant Reformation be as successful as it was. And I think actually our social media platforms sort of hold a similar place to the printing press. If used in the right way, they are an incredible evangelistic tool. For a lot of people, our social media profiles will be the first contact with God that they've ever had. If they've never met a Christian or they've never been into a church, actually, you know, they may follow us on social media, and that's a huge responsibility, and it's terrifying, but actually what an amazing opportunity. Dr. Bex Lewis, who has written a really good book on social media and children and kind of how we protect them, but sort of let them fly at the same point. She says that let me just get the quote. The good news will not spread itself on the internet. We have to think of ourselves as digital disciples. And I think that's a really helpful thing. I've got a photo here. You probably won't be able to see it, but I'll show you anyway. Oh, sorry. Having said that I do media, not very good. So this is a 17-year-old kid, and I don't know if you can see the photo. He is in his church worship band, and he posts a lot about being in church. And in this photo, he's sort of thrown his Fender Telecaster to one side. He's got his hands in the air, and he's sort of lost in worship, love, and praise. And it says on it, "What a weekend, #thank you, Lord." This kid has got like over 700 friends on Facebook. He goes to a secular music college. And actually, what a powerful tool. What an amazing way of being a digital disciple. I organised a youth event recently where we actively told the young people not to turn their phones off, but to pick them up and to use them throughout the day. So we asked them to tweet in and text in their questions that we were going to try and answer throughout the day, to follow our hashtag, to upload their photos to Instagram and to Facebook and to tag us while they were doing it. And they loved it, because when do they normally get that opportunity? I think if we're blessed enough to have young people in our congregation, we really need to try and think about ways that we can get them to actively engage with these things. To be honest, they're not going to put their phones down, so you might as well get them And what an amazing evangelistic opportunity. If they sort of check in on Facebook when they come into church and say, where are you? I'm at Holy Trinity, whatever. And they tweet a soundbite from the sermon, and then maybe they Snapchat or Instagram a photo of them hanging out with their mates at church. Wouldn't they be brilliant conversation starters like that kid, hands up in worship, hashtag thank you Lord. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about youth culture now, but just before we do that, I'm going to make use of the sweets. I'm going to give you all a little bit of a test. So could you all stand up, please? I'm going to read out a few things that I think are kind of inherent in our culture, and particularly our youth culture. And if you don't know what it is, so when I get to a point where you don't know what it is, I want you to sit down. And by know what it is, I mean if I dragged you up to the front, you could explain to everyone else what it is. So you need to be sure that you know what it is, okay? So, right, Snapchat. Strong start. Sexting. Oh yeah, this is bad order. I tried to do it in order of things. Tinder. Instagram. Mashup. You all know what mashup is. Stand up. It's when you mash up a song, different. Yeah, come on. Stand up. Selfie. Even the Pope knows what a selfie is. YOLO. No. You only live once. FIFA. Call of Duty. No, I mean the football thing, yeah. Call of Duty. Divergent. Oh, you're all down with the kids. Dub smash. In fairness, I'm going to put my hands up and say I only learned about that at the weekend because a teenager showed me. So I'll sit down. Skepta. Okay, we're all sat down. Everyone before dub smash, stand up. Right, I'm going to give you sweets anyway. It just kind of goes to show that actually we are sort of speaking a foreign language when it comes to youth culture. And I think I don't need to tell you that youth culture isn't what it used to be. There's a shocking example of this. In 1940, the California Police Department released kind of the 7 worst things in California, and they were talking in class, chewing gum, getting out of line, running in the halls, making a noise, wearing improper clothes, and not putting waste in the waste paper basket. Pretty naughty. In 1990, these problems were drug abuse, alcohol abuse, pregnancy, rape, suicide, robbery, and assault. So you can see that even just in those few years, there's been a dramatic change in youth culture. I don't know how many of you have read the book Sticky Faith. It's kind of it's looking at lots of research into why young people are falling out of the church. And it says that, so it's an American book, and they say that between 40 to 50% of young people leave their faith completely when they leave high school. And some have argued actually that this statistic is as high as 80%. And it's not just a problem for America. There was a research done by the Church of England recently that said that on any given Sunday in the Church of England, over half of the churches wouldn't have any young people at all. Over half of the churches. There's a verse which every time I read it, it sends shivers down my spine. It says this: after that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things that he had done. I just think that's kind of where we're at, isn't it? We've got a generation who doesn't acknowledge the Lord and has no idea what he's done. But why is a generation growing up that doesn't know God? Why is there such a high fall-away rate from those who were in a church but aren't anymore when they leave high school? Well, I'm sure there's lots of different reasons, and I'm sure you guys have got better theories than me, but I think one of the reasons is that we often fail to let our young people think for themselves. I think we often kind of encourage them to effectively leave their brains at the door when they come into our youth groups. And that then means that when they're challenged to think critically about matters of faith at school or maybe later at university or in the workplace, they then equate sort of not thinking with faith, and they dismiss their faith as not being intellectually viable. I think we often think that our young people aren't old enough or smart enough to deal with complicated things like the historicity of the Bible, why there's suffering, what about science and God. And yet the thing is, these are really real subject matters that they're discussing in their RE classes, in the playground, God forbid, in the pub. So actually, why are we not trying to deal with these in our youth groups, in our churches. I think it's really important to say that our young people aren't too young to be thinking critically about their faith. You just got to look at the Bible for that example. David was a small boy when he became king. Josiah was only 8. And still as a young man, he led an entire reformation, bringing everyone back to the Book of the Covenant. And then you've got people like Esther and Daniel, and that's just the Old Testament. Jesus was only 12 when he began to engage with some of the rabbis in the synagogue. And then on the other spectrum of that, a lot of the new atheists actually lost their faith early in their teenage years. Up until 100 years ago, the teenage years were viewed as the initial stages of adulthood rather than kind of the final stages of childhood, which is what we view it now. And I think even in the Jewish bar mitzvah, you can see that, because at 13 years old, they're basically celebrating that young person becoming an adult. I think we really need to stop implying that our young people won't be important until they're older. And we need to actively try and engage them in the life of the church now if we can. I hear so many people tell our young people that they're the church of tomorrow. That is just not true. Our young people aren't the church of tomorrow. They're the church of today. Spot on. I think it's a lie that we've been fed that apologetics isn't for teenagers, and it's certainly not for young people. But the problem is our young people are being fed ideas and arguments from all over the place, from the beauty industry, from the fashion industry, from their teachers, from their friends. Everyone else is doing apologetics with them, so why aren't we? When I worked in TV, one of the things that we were always doing was trying to aim our content at the age group higher than the target audience that we were going for, because kids always want to be older than they are. And I think the only way we're going to get our young people to listen is if we stop patronising them and start treating them like adults. Martin Luther famously thought that Christian formation begins with youth ministry. And he said this: if ever the church is to flourish again, one must begin by instructing the young. I just think that's quite a good challenge, actually. What are we doing to engage the hearts and the minds of our young people? It's nearly time for a break. I just want to quickly look a little bit more at our culture. So Leslie Newbigin was a missionary in India for 40 years. And when he came back to England in 1974, he basically found that the Christian culture that he'd left, when he came back, it had itself become a mission field. In Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles. They've been deported from Jerusalem, and they're living in this foreign land in Babylon. And he says this: seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you will prosper too. I think we really need to pray for our city or our town or our village, whatever our culture is, that we're right in the middle. We need to love our city. And I think it's important to say that we're a bit like the exiles in Babylon. We are straddled between two cities, the city of God and the city of this world. We need to ask the same question that the Israelites asked in Psalm 137. How do we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? If we moved to a foreign country and we wanted to kind of fit in and get to know the locals, we'd learn the language and we'd learn the culture. And actually, I think we need to learn about our Babylon. Whatever that Babylon is for you, it's going to look different for each of you. We need to learn about our Babylon in order to love it better and to draw it to Jerusalem, to the city of God. We need to learn to sing the songs of Zion in the foreign land. 1 Chronicles 12:32 talks about men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. If it's true that 70% of people in today's culture are never going to set a foot in a church, then actually changing the worship in our services isn't going to reach them. Fresh expressions of church, no matter how exciting they are, isn't going to reach them. Alpha courses and Christianity Explored courses isn't going to reach them. We need to think about not changing the product, but actually going out beyond our walls and meeting them where people are, rather than them wanting to meet us where we are. We need to meet them where they're at, rather than where we'd like them to be. And we need to learn to speak their language. We've seen that religious language is just not really known. We need to learn to preach the gospel in a way that they'll actually understand. So C.S. Lewis famously said that any fool can write learned language. The vernacular is the real test. And he says if you can't turn your faith into the vernacular, either you don't understand it or you don't believe it. Pretty challenging stuff. Acts 17, Paul is at the Areopagus in Athens, and he quotes a poem. And I think we quite often see Paul quoting the scriptures. He doesn't often seem to quote kind of unbelievers' writings, but when he's speaking to unbelievers, he doesn't quote the scriptures. He quotes one of their poems. He quotes an Athenian poem. And I think if you look at the Greek text, lots of the commentators say that from the Greek, it looks like he really intimately knows this poem. He hasn't just read it once, he's really actively studied it. He knows the Athenian culture, and he uses his knowledge of the Athenian culture to point people to the unknown God, and then explains who the unknown God is. And I think we need to do that. We need to understand our culture in order to point it back to Jesus. And I think there probably are lots of people who still like poetry, but I think probably the modern day equivalent, it might be different for you guys, is music and film. I think music has always been a big part of youth culture. It's kind of how young people define themselves, how they express themselves. It's often part of their identity. And actually, I think we need to be creative in the way that we use music and film, both kind of in our churches, but outside of our church walls as well. I was talking to a youth leader yesterday who said that one thing that he always encouraged his parents and the vicar to do was to download the top 10 each week so that they could be aware of what the young people were listening to. And I think with things like Spotify or whatever, you can do that for free now, so there's no reason not to do that. But also being creative in the way that you use film. I mean, we do a lot of movie sermons in our church, but again, that's expecting them to come to us, which is obviously not true because sometimes it's just me and Will. But what about going to the cinema with non-Christians and then just kind of going for a drink afterwards or a latte if they're under 18 and discussing some of the kind of the themes that come up? And actually, you never know, there's so much religious imagery in films, and natural conversation may arise even without you kind of forcing it. I think often we resign ourselves as the church to not being culturally relevant. We're never going to understand the culture, therefore what is the point of even trying to be culturally relevant? And I think to a certain extent, that's kind of true. We're never going to get to know the culture as well as the people who have grown up with it. But I think actually this is where we need to be brave, and we need to be humble, and we need to ask those young people to take us by the hand and show us their culture. So we need to get to know the culture, but also we need to try and be a bit distinctive from the culture. In Acts 13:36, it says, David served God's purpose in his own generation. Yes, we need to understand the culture in order to reach out to it, but we're also called to be countercultural and to transform society. David was served God's purpose in his generation. I think it's important to say that culture is always changing. Rick Warren says that the word contemporary literally means with temporariness. And he goes on to say, by nature, nothing contemporary is meant to last forever. He says, never attach your church to a single style, because you'll soon be passé and outdated. The only way to stay relevant is to anchor your ministry to unchanging truths and eternal purposes, while being willing to continually adapt how you communicate these truths. So we do need to be relevant, but we need to make sure that we're not pursuing relevance as a means, as an end in itself. I think sometimes we get a bit kind of caught up in the means and forget about the message. Part of our appeal as the church is that we are distinctive. I think in a culture that is completely self-centered, judgmental, consumerist, actually a society that, is meant to prefer the other, be full of grace, and actively serves the poor, that is attractive, the fact that we are distinctive. Tim Chester and Steve Timms have written a book called Everyday Church, which gives some kind of helpful examples of how you can be everyday church. And they say this: the more we become like the world, the less we have to offer. What will draw people to the church is always going to be what's different about us. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I just want to end this little section. In 1 Corinthians 9, 20, 22, Paul says that who becomes like the Jews to reach the Jews, he becomes like the Gentiles to reach the Gentiles, he becomes all things to all people in order to reach a few. And I think we do need to alter the way that we share the message when we're reaching different people, but the message needs to stay the same. John Mark Reynolds, who's another apologist, says we should create and not just consume culture. So I would love you now, I think maybe 10, I don't know what the time is, maybe 10 minutes break. If it takes less time than that, that's fine. There's some questions on the first page of your sheet, just to have a think about some of those questions, like in little groups, and think about it in your context. So I'm going to do a bit more of kind of an exposition on that verse now. So I think I printed the verse out on the top of your handouts, but you know what it is. It's worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if anyone asks you about your Christian hope, always be ready to explain it, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. So let's have a look at that first bit. Worship Christ as Lord of your life. I think it's really clear from this passage and kind of from the Bible as a whole that worship is the starting point of evangelism. We share our faith as a response to what God has done for us. I love being around new Christians. They're just so excited, and they kind of re-excite me about my faith because they just kind of can't help but share the good news. You know, they get so excited about the fact that they've been forgiven and they've got a new life that it's just exuding out of them. And I think it's really important that that is where evangelism starts. Father Donovan, who's the missionary who I was talking about before, he says that the work of mission begins with the rediscovery of the gospel by the missionaries themselves. I'm a vicar's kid, and over the years I've just seen far too many vicars and youth leaders burn out. And I think, you know, it's a really tough position doing what you guys do, and we need to really protect ourselves from burnout. We need to get excited or even re-excited about the gospel before we can begin to share it. And we need to get excited before we can encourage our congregations to share it as well. Donald Miller in Blue Like Jazz says, "I couldn't share something that I wasn't experiencing myself." And I think that's a really key part of how we do evangelism and apologetics. We've got to get excited ourselves. We're constantly being told, aren't we, that the most important person to lead is ourselves, for our own well-being, but also for the sake of our congregations. I'm teaching you to suck eggs here, but we do really need to be regularly fired up by the Word of God and filled up by the Holy Spirit. We need to pray with Wesley that God will set us on fire every day and that we'll go out and people will watch us burn. We need to pray that for our congregations as well, that they'll get set on fire each day and that they'll go out and people will watch them burn as well. So worship Christ as Lord of your life. Let's look at the second part of that. The second part of that, Lord of your life, that implies complete control. And I think we need to ask ourselves the honest question, are there parts of our life that if we're really honest with ourselves, withholding from him because it's a little bit easier and it's a little bit less scary? I know that there certainly are parts of my life that I would much rather hold on to, but I think I'm really challenged by what C.S. Lewis said about this. God cannot bless us until he has us. When we try to keep within us an area that is our own, we try to keep an area of death. Therefore, in love, he claims all. I mean, that's pretty extreme. We keep an area of death. But I love that in love, he claims all. Evangelism starts with us, but it doesn't start with a worn out, destroyed us. It starts with a sold out, giving everything for God us. And actually, evangelism flows from us as leaders into the church and then into the world. So we really need to work on making sure that we're excited. Yes, we should be praying for revival, but actually, what if the means for revival is sat in your seat right now, or in your congregation seat, or in your youth, in the seats of your youth group? Evangelism starts with us. Then the verse goes on to say, worship Christ as Lord of your life, and if someone asks, the implication here is that people are going to be asking you questions. It assumes that people are going to be asking you questions. And if we're honest, are we living a life that provokes questions? Does our life look any different from the lives of our non-Christians, our non-Christian friends? In Everyday Church, Tim Chester and Steve Timmis ask this: when were you last asked to give an account for your hope? They say, are we living a life that makes no sense without the gospel? That's a challenging question, isn't it? Are we living a life that makes no sense without the gospel? They go on to say, if we live out our relationship with Christ in a way that expresses itself in distinctive obedience to his lordship, then the world will either be drawn to that light or it will try and extinguish it. For so many of the people I've met who've become Christians, it's because they saw something different in a Christian friend of theirs and they were intrigued by what it was that made them different. And that then challenged them to go to church or to do some sort of Alpha or Christianity Explored course. But the instigating factor was a Christian friend living distinctively. I don't know if you guys are more rugby or football or neither. I'm sure there's plenty of examples, but Linvoy Primus, who was a footballer who played for a bunch of different teams, but I guess most famously Portsmouth. There we go. See, my husband's a Southampton fan. I'm not. And then we've got sort of Jason Robinson, who is famously England's fullback. For both of them, they became a Christian because of a Christian teammate, and they were so kind of intrigued by this Christian teammate's behaviour both on and off the pitch that it made them think about these things. And Linvoy Primus wrote an autobiography called Transformed. And I think actually that's a real challenge to us. For Linvoy Primus, his life was completely transformed by Christ. Are we living lives whereby we are completely transformed and people can see that we've been transformed? Lee Strobel said that 21st century apologetics must come from a person... 21st century apologetics must come from a person whose life is authentically changed by Christ. Yes, our words are important, but actually our lives are an apologetic. I think people around us are much more likely to listen to us if the lives that we're living match up to what we say. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said something which has been challenging me since I heard it, which was a long time ago. It says, your life as a Christian should make non-believers question their disbelief in God. Your life as a Christian should make non-believers question their disbelief in God. Our lives should be so appealing, so out there, that actually it challenges what people think. 1 Peter 2, verse 12, so just a chapter before this big passage on apologetics, says, live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. In a generation that really has no reference point for God, we need to show them what a life with God looks like. Donald Miller, again in Blue Like Jazz, says, sometimes you have to watch somebody love something before you can love it yourself. It's as if they're showing you the way. We need to show the non-Christians in our society how to love God, how we love God, which is incredibly challenging. And I know it's not easy. So we've looked at some of the harrowing statistics of young people falling away from the church. But actually, for a lot of the young people who do keep their faith, it's often because of the example of an older Christian. So whether that's a youth leader or a parent or someone else in the church, it's often because of an example of someone who's kind of lived that life before them. Just after the Shema, you definitely all know how to say it better than me, in Deuteronomy, that's the love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind. It says this in verse 6, you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I'm giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road, when you go to bed and when you get up. But Jewish parents weren't called just to teach their children. They were taught to show them godliness as well. I think it's really important to say that we need models and not just theories, especially when it comes to young people. We're always being told that more is caught than is taught. We need to model what we believe. We need to learn how to communicate why we believe and how we came to faith. I think it's really interesting. I've lost count of the number of young people who've asked me how I met my husband, how we fell in love. And even the boys, although they don't admit it, they love hearing those stories. But actually, what if we got as excited telling the stories about how we fell in love with Jesus? I think stories are a really powerful thing, and different people's stories will resonate with different people. And I think if we're being good examples, particularly to our young people, we really need to be authentic. I think teenagers can spot frauds a mile off. In a world that excels in kind of faux marketing and artificiality, we've got to be real and we've got to be honest, because that is what our young people are desperate to see. In Mark 12, verse 14, people say to Jesus, we know that you are a man of integrity. Jesus led a really accessible and transparent life. And so, although it's incredibly challenging and probably painful at times, we need to live our lives with integrity, which means sharing our struggles, sharing our mistakes, admitting we don't know the answers to everything. But when we glory in our weakness, it will point to Jesus. I also think it means being true to who you are and not pretending to be something you're not to kind of win over the youth. There's a guy who's studying with us at the moment at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. He is an actor from Brooklyn, New York, and he is quite frankly the coolest person I've ever met. And he was telling his testimony at a school assembly, and he said this: his cool became my cool even though I'm not cool, is that cool? To be honest, I have no idea what he was trying to say with that, but it went down brilliantly and they loved it. But if I'd have got up on the stage and said that, they'd have been like, what? I'd have been laughed off the stage. But it worked for him because he is just inherently cool. And I think, I don't know how to say this without being rude, but potentially on the other side of the spectrum, my vicar, I really hope he's not listening to this, my vicar is an absolute legend. He's amazing, but he's probably not what a young person would call cool. The landscape of his youth was very different from our youth today. But he speaks really powerfully into that generation because he doesn't try to pretend to be something he's not. But he's also always ready to learn something new. And he's one of those people that we talked about earlier who humbly asks these young people to take him by the hand and show them into their culture. So I think you just need to be true to who you are. You know, if you hate social media, that's fine, hate social media, but ask the young people what they're doing on social media or whatever. So let's go back to that verse, 1 Peter 3:15. The verbs in this part of the letter are all plural. It's addressed to the whole Christian community as well as to individuals. So Graham Tomlin says in The Provocative Church, when church begins to be truly itself, it won't be able to stop itself being evangelistic. I don't know how many of you saw the Kevin Costner film in the 90s, Field of Dreams. He's told to build a baseball diamond. It's a diamond, right? A baseball diamond. I should stick to English sports. But a baseball diamond on his field. And they say to him, if you build it, they will come. And they do. There's scores of people come and watch these baseball games. And I think as a church, we've tended towards that theory that if we build it, they will come. You know, if we have the right worship, if we do the right things in the church, they'll come. But I think as we've already seen today, that's not where we are anymore. 70% of people are never going to set foot in the church. So we need to stop doing stuff inside the church and move outside of the church. In Everyday Church, Tim Chester and Steve Timmis say that rather than creating these attractional events, we need to create attractional communities. As we've already said, we need to meet people where they're at, not where we want them to be. 1 Peter tells us to have distinctive lives. It tells us that our lives are to be these evangelistic events. But it's not just our lives individually, although that is a part of it. It's our lives together. I met a young guy recently. I'm going to call him Tom. And he was kicked out of the church as a young teenager for being gay. And it obviously hurt him. He never went back to church. And he met this lovely girl at university who was a Christian. And they became very good friends. And she just loved him. And then she introduced him to her family, and they welcomed him in with open arms, and they just loved him. And sure, they'd talk about God when it came up in conversations, but above all, they just loved him. And this Easter, he came to church with her. She brought him to church, and he was just blown away by the welcome that he received, and the grace in this community, and the grace in the message. And I had a conversation with him afterwards, and he just said, is this the gospel? Is this what it's really about? Is grace? And it totally kind of changed his theory of what he thought about God. But it started with one girl's evangelistic life, and then the community of this family. And I think that's often the pattern. Someone will meet an individual, then they'll be introduced to a community, and then once they feel safe in that community, they'll then set foot in the church. I think often people are attracted to a Christian community before they're attracted to the Christian message. I think it's fair to say that in our churches, no matter how all singing or dancing your church is, you're never going to outperform HBO, nor is your music ever going to rival MTV. My husband's the worship leader, so I maybe won't say that. But, you know, we're never going to be as good necessarily as the secular world, but that's not what draws people to the church. I think there is nothing like the community that is centered around Jesus. Nowhere else will you find diverse people united around one common purpose. I was part of an Alpha course recently where we had the pleasure of seeing two guys become Christians, one who was, still is in rehab, a recovering drug addict, and one who was a former drug dealer. And it's amazing seeing them worship next to each other in church. But the former drug dealer was getting baptized, and because he's so tall, the vicar needed a hand sort of doing the physical dunking. And the guy who offered to do it was this recovering drug addict. And I just thought, what an amazing picture of the gospel. This guy, this recovering drug addict, is standing, baptizing someone who pretty much epitomizes all the mess in his life, and baptizing him. That is the gospel. Where else, other than the church of broken people, going to find a home? Where else are those outsiders going to be welcomed in? We're attractive because we're different, because we are centered around Jesus. A worshipping community who loves each other despite its differences is going to eventually provoke questions. And in the same way, if we're living as a community, sort of selling ourselves out to bless others, at some point those people who are being blessed are going to ask why we're doing it. And that then gives us an opportunity to tell them why we're doing it. But the initiative comes from us just blessing them. In a society that is just full of hopelessness, I think people are drawn to a community that is full of hope, not just for this life, but beyond the grave. And ultimately, we're drawing them to their ultimate hope giver. We're gonna have a quick break now, and I wonder, I've got some questions on the second sheet, but I wonder if maybe we should just have a bit more worship. Is that all right, Jeff? I just think the key thing I think that I was saying there is that before we can do evangelism, we need to be fired up ourselves. So I think maybe we could use this as a bit of an opportunity to pray for ourselves, even if we're feeling brave, pray for the person next to us, just that we'll get fired up. So, talking of questions, Richard Dawkins, God love him, vehemently opposes kids being brought up in a religion. He says that it's akin to child abuse, and he thinks that kids shouldn't be indoctrinated, but they should be allowed to make their own decision when they're old enough. And I obviously wouldn't put it as strongly as Dawkins. I clearly don't think it's child abuse. I am a vicar's kid after all. But I do think actually it's a really helpful thing to bring up children to think for themselves, to question things and not just to parrot our answers. And actually that is what apologetics is. So I want to talk a little bit about questions. There are so many young people outside of our youth groups and so many adults in our parishes as well for whom God is just not on the radar. I was chatting to someone earlier about the fact that actually atheists, in a way, at least they kind of think something. And it's that kind of apathy that I think is most dangerous, that I've got my opinion, you've got your opinion. How do you even begin to engage with these guys? Well, what would Jesus do, as the famous bracelets say? I think he'd probably ask them questions. So if you look at the New Testament, Jesus asks over 150 questions across the four Gospels. You know, people may think that they're sorted, that they've got their worldview sorted, but what if we gently begin to challenge some of their presuppositions? What if we begin to gently ask them a few questions? Why do you think you're here? What do you think happens to us when we die? If God does exist, what do you think he thinks of you? Obviously, we've got to have a good relationship with these people before we start to have these conversations. I think it's probably not one for the hairdresser chair or the back of the taxi, although don't rule it out. But I think actually it is probably quite important that you have a good relationship with these guys to start with. I also think it's important that we don't just shoehorn these questions into conversations. And I also think it's important that the initiative comes from them. We're not just kind of steering a conversation in a completely different direction. But questions can be a really helpful thing because they can be a brilliant conversation starter, and they can also help us to think about things in a totally different way. There's a guy called Greg Kukul who's an apologist, and he's written a book called Tactics, and it's kind of all about how we do this sort of subtle ninja apologetics. And he talks a lot about using questions, and he says this: never make a statement, at least at first, when a question will do the job, which I think is quite interesting. And the thing about questions is they can do all sorts of things to help us. So they can help to get rid of wrong assumption. So for instance, if I ask someone if they think they're going to go to heaven, that maybe gives us an opportunity to talk about the fact that you don't get there by doing good things, which is obviously what lots of people think. But, you know, really this is how you get to heaven. Questions can help to expose faulty logic. So if I ask someone, do you think science or God is more reliable? That then gives us the opportunity to talk about the fact that it's not just those two options. There is, in fact, a third option, which lots of Christian scientists would attest to. Questions clarify meaning. I think it's really important that we ask questions to really begin to understand what people are saying. If we don't understand what people are saying, we're in danger of misrepresenting their view. So Gregory Kukul, again in his book Tactics, says you may find that you've given a brilliant refutation of a view that the other person doesn't actually hold. We ask questions to find out exactly what it is that they think. I think as Christians, I mean, the new atheists do it all the time as well, but I think as Christians we are often in danger of building a weak or a wrong position of someone, and then we knock it down and we look superior and we're like, aha, God triumphs. And obviously in philosophy that's called a straw man fallacy, where you build up a kind of fake position to then knock it down. And I think actually as Christians, if anything, we need to make a stronger case for them. We need to make their opinion look even better than it probably is. And then we need to have the confidence that when we put the gospel alongside it, that actually it will, in and of itself, be the more compelling, the more truthful, the more workable worldview. Questions can show us people's motives. I think sometimes we will engage with conversations where they're clearly just trying to win an intellectual battle. But sometimes people will get into discussions and maybe ask questions because of a really significant issue in their life. And I think we're going to answer very differently when we're just engaging in these intellectual battles than we would with someone who's asking about the problem of suffering because their mum's just died. We need to ask questions to find out where they're coming from. Michael Ramsden, who heads up RZAM, the charity that I work for, talks about the question behind, the questioner behind the question. And actually, I think often there's something else going on behind the question that they're asking. Sometimes there's a question behind the question. Sometimes behind the kind of aggressive statement, there's a real heartfelt question going on. And actually, it's only by us asking them questions that we can really figure out actually what is the heart of what they're trying to ask. Questions also shift the emphasis. I think a lot of non-Christians understandably want proof for stuff, and they put the burden of proof on us. And if we ask questions, we can try and turn that conversation around and put the onus on them to defend their position. So, for instance, what lots of my friends say is, there's no evidence for God. And so rather than kind of coming back with here's the cosmological argument, the teleological, we could say, why do you think there's no evidence? Or what evidence would it take for you to think, what evidence for you would be satisfying? And then you know much more about what it is, and you kind of put the emphasis on them. And by doing that, you can steer conversations away from kind of unhelpful topics back to the core gospel message. But I think most importantly, questions show that we care about what people think. I think, if you get into a conversation and you're not asking questions, you're just kind of lecturing them with your ready-made answers. I say you, I mean we as well. We're lecturing them with their ready-made answers, I've got this answer, I've got this answer. Whereas if we're asking questions, we show that their opinions matter, that we really care about what they think. In traditional media, it was very much broadcasting opinion. You'd hear the opinion of the broadcaster, the presenter, the expert, and that's what I love about social media. It does what it says on the tin. It's social. It's much more interactive. It invites questions. It asks people's opinions. On social media, everyone has a voice. Everyone has a legitimate voice. And I think we maybe need to think of our evangelism more in terms of social media, in that kind of interactive thing where actually we're actively asking questions and listening to other people's opinions rather than just traditional broadcasting our opinions over and over. So it's important that we ask questions to try and figure out where people are coming from and everything like that. But it's also, I think, important that we encourage people's questions. I think often the church is seen wrongly, probably, as a place where you don't have any questions, you don't have any doubts, you just come, these are the answers. And I think particularly for young people, that's a really hard thing to get their heads around. I think one of the most frustrating things about teenagers is their tendency to question everything. And criticise everything. And although this can be really annoying at times, it actually is a really helpful thing, I think. In the mid-70s, there was a shift in education from the didactic model, which was very much kind of teacher learning by rote, to the critical method, which was much more sort of interactive. These are a few thoughts. What do you guys think? Question what I think. And that's the kind of education that we've got going on in our schools at the moment. And I think we need to encourage that in the way that we teach our young people in our churches as well. And I think it's important for Christians, but it's also important for non-Christians. So for a non-Christian teenager, for instance, if they do finally become a Christian, they'll know that they've come to that conclusion for themselves. And they'll know that actually it stands up to scrutiny on their own method of understanding. And for the Christians, if we don't let them ask their questions, we're either in danger of them having a completely blind faith, or they'll turn away to something that does answer their questions. If we encourage them to ask questions, they'll have a much stronger faith in the long run, and it will mean that they're not just borrowing our faith. There's a really interesting blog on Christian parenting, and on it says this. She's called Natasha Crane, and she says, "Make no mistake, a borrowed faith leaving home can be just as dangerous as a broken faith. The result is often the same, just delayed." And I think that's really interesting. If our young people are just kind of borrowing our faith, then actually when the proverbial excrement hits the fan, they've got nothing to stand on because it's not their own faith. They're relying on their parents' faith. And she goes on to say this: the number one sign that your parents are just borrowing your faith is that they rarely, if ever, ask questions. I think when young people ask questions, or when anyone asks questions, it gives a real insight into their lives. They're often asking because of a significant issue that they've been dealing with themselves. We get a glimpse into their story, which is a really special thing. I think it's really important that we leave space for their response, and we need to know that it's okay if they disagree with us or ask us more questions, because it shows that actually they're taking it really seriously. We also need to give them the opportunity to express their doubts. I think it's really important that doubt isn't a dirty word in our youth group or our churches or even our non-Christian communities. For a start, we're explicitly commanded to be merciful to those who doubt. It says in Jude 22, "Be merciful to those who doubt." We need to provide a safe space for people to express their doubts and to sort of support them in their struggles and work through them in their doubts. I think if we do this, we'll take the pressure off our young people to be perfect. I've seen so many young people leave the church because they think that they failed to meet what they believe are the high standards of the church. And that's heartbreaking. They think that God doesn't accept them because of something they've done. And I think this is tragically epitomised in the words of Mumford & Sons' Winter Winds, which says, "Oh, the shame that sent me off from the God that I once loved was the same that sent me into your arms." The shame that sent me off from the God that I once loved was the same that sent me into your arms. We need to make sure that our churches aren't a place of shame that turns our young people to other people's arms. We need to create a place, like it says in Lamentations 3:22, where his mercies are new every morning. We're going to have another quick break now. You can carry on conversations in the break if you so choose, and please do take these questions home and think about them and ask opinion of other people in your congregation and stuff. I'm sorry there's not much time to discuss them. I'll just do the last little section and then we can have some coffee. So let's go back to that verse. Worship Christ as Lord of your life, and if someone asks you to give a reason for your hope, always be ready to explain it. So if someone asks you about your Christian hope, well, what is our Christian hope? Well, it certainly isn't the Jesus is my sunshine philosophy, the idea that as soon as you become a Christian, everything is happy and forever shiny. Christian hope is so much deeper than that. It's the assurance that we have been truly forgiven and infinitely loved because of what Jesus did at the cross. And it's the knowledge that even in the midst of the storm, that God won't let go of us. I think it's really important that, like we've talked about, we live a transformed life, we live an exemplary life. But it's also important that we remember that we live in a broken world, and actually we need to have the humility to be real in our struggles. Professor John Lennox, who I work with, amazing man, he's an Oxford maths professor, but he's also just a brilliant Christian. And he says that it's really important to say, "I don't know," in conversations. And he is a really clever man, so I doubt there's anything he doesn't know. But it shows that he's on the same level as the people that he's engaging with. I had a conversation with the girl who I used to live with. We were talking about suffering, and we were going through sort of every answer to the problem of suffering. And towards the end of the conversation, I told her something which she already knew, that a friend of mine had just committed suicide, and that I had no idea why that had happened, why God didn't step in and do something about it. But that I knew that actually, despite all of that, I had a God who loved me and who was just as upset as I was, and he was holding me in the pain. And she told me afterwards that that was the most powerful thing that I'd said, that actually she sort of wasn't really listening to any of the answers. I mean, I could have saved myself a lot of time. But I think actually there's something really significant about that. I think the fact that I still believed and still loved God, even though I didn't know all the answers, that meant so much more to her than all of the answers that I could give. I think we need to learn to say, "I don't know." When we admit that we don't have the answers, it shows that we're real people, and it points us away from ourselves and onto the God who does have the answers and who holds people in their pain. Once we begin to understand our Christian hope, truly understand our Christian hope, I think it makes engaging with non-Christians much easier, Because if we know that we've got something that these guys are desperately seeking, then it makes it much easier to have that conversation. I was chatting to a guy at Alpha recently who works in the media, so we were talking about journalism and kind of who even tells the truth in journalism anymore. And he said, I have no idea who's telling the truth anymore, which is probably why I ended up at Alpha. And I think that's really interesting. He came because he just has no idea who's telling the truth. And actually he came because he just made a film with some Christians. And again, he was intrigued by their lives. So a combination of being intrigued by their lives and knowing that actually he had no idea who was telling the truth anymore, that brought him to Alpha. Often non-Christians are drawn to Christians and to the church because they sense that actually in us and in our churches is a glimpse of hope in what is increasingly an even more hopeless world. So worship Christ as Lord of your life, and if someone asks you about your Christian hope, always be ready to explain it. Yes, we can share our lives with people, and yes, we can invite them into a loving community, but it is also important what we say. Our words, fueled by the power of the Holy Spirit, do have the power to change people's lives. You see plenty of examples in the Gospels of people who were amazed by Jesus' teaching. An example of this is in Luke 9:48, where it says that the people hung on his every words. And so too for Paul, he's constantly reasoning with the people, persuading the people. It says in Acts 17:2 that he used the scriptures to reason with them. He explained the prophecies and he proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. And then it goes on to say that some of the Jews who were listening were persuaded. But for both Jesus and for Paul, the purpose of their words was to point people to God and to ultimately encourage them to start a relationship with him. In Acts 26, when Paul is brought up before King Agrippa says to Paul, "Are you trying to make me a Christian?" And Paul says, "Whether quickly or not, I pray to God that both you and everyone here in this audience might become the same as I am, except for these chains." Effectively, yes, I'm trying to make you a Christian, is what he says. I think it's really important to note that we can't share our faith until we really know what it is, why we believe it, and most importantly, what difference it's made in our own lives. I often find that God conversations come up when I'm least expecting it. I think probably some of the most significant God conversations I've ever had have been at 1 a.m. in the middle of a dance floor or in a kebab house. I think we need to be ready at any point. And that word, always be ready to give an answer, in some translations it says always be prepared. Either way in the Greek, I'm going to say this wrong, and again, you'll probably know way better than me, hetoimos. That word has got connotations of athletic training. The idea is that we need to be prepared in the same way that an athlete wouldn't go and run a race without doing some training. And one of the ways that we can be prepared is to begin to try and understand some of the objections to the Christian faith. One of the sort of famous objections by the new atheists is that our faith is blind. And there's a blog, which I think I've put this on your notes. It says, if people just use logic, they would understand, sadly, that the core belief of any religion is faith, which technically means belief without proof. So many of my non-Christian friends think that I believe in spite of the evidence or with no evidence. But I think it's really important that we kind of share the fact that our faith isn't based on no evidence. We have faith in things based on evidence in the same way that we would in normal life. So, for instance, if I was going to have an operation, I would put much more faith in a surgeon who's done the operation tons of times than I would in a recent trainee. Sure, it's faith, but it's based on my knowledge that he's done lots of operations. And I think that's the kind of faith we have as Christians. It's faith based on the evidence. Another one of their major objections is the nature of God. They believe that God is a moral monster or a vindictive kid with a magnifying glass. There's a guy called David Robertson who is an evangelist and a vicar in Scotland, and he jokes that the cry of the atheists is that there is no God and I hate him. Love that. I think the thing is, a lot of people think that if there was a God, if he did exist, he would hate them. He wouldn't like them. He wouldn't approve of what they're doing. And I think they've just completely misunderstood his character. There's no knowledge of the God that we believe in, a God of love who would do anything, did do everything to reconcile the world to himself. And I think it's really important that we get across the message that we also don't believe in the God that they don't believe in. That's not our God. Then there are lots of specific objections, so science and suffering and the fact that miracles don't happen. And a lot of these objections are really complicated, and there are some amazing resources out there by people like John Lennox. But there's also real power in the words, "let me think about it." I think that buys us a lot of time. It means we can go and research these things. But it also shows that we're taking their point of view seriously. We're not just kind of dismissing what they're saying. But we do then need to actually go and think about it. It's very important to acknowledge that this is all God's initiative. We don't convert people. God does that. But sometimes these people need help trying to sort out some of their head barriers before we can even think about a heart commitment. Another way of being prepared is to try and understand someone's worldview. I think it's really important to say that no one starts from neutral. I think we're often kind of put on the back foot where atheists will say, well, you've got a faith position, I don't have a faith position. No one starts from neutral. Everyone's got a faith position, even if that's no faith. We've all been conditioned by whatever it is we believe in, and we bring those things into these conversations. No one starts from neutral. Elaine de Botton, who is sort of being hailed as the most popular atheist philosopher out there, I think Dawkins has burnt a fair few bridges by being so aggressive, but Elaine de Botton is just a lovely atheist. And he says this in his book, Religion for Atheists. "I was brought up by a father who made Richard Dawkins look open-minded on the matter of there being a supreme being. I simply can't imagine joining a faith that's very foreign to me in terms of my background. I would feel it to be a betrayal of my family. By accepting the father, I'd be going against my father." He has been conditioned to think that as much as we have been conditioned, no one starts from neutral. The last thing I want to say, we're nearly done now, is that words have power. Persuasive arguments can bring people closer to God, or at least kind of help them get rid of some of those barriers, but reason has its limits. Sometimes we'll give someone all the clever answers we know, and actually that's not enough. John Lennox says that if a person cannot see reason, reason isn't their problem. And I think for a lot of people, there's underlying emotional objections. It's not just a kind of head issue. Francis Spufford in Unapologetics says, "Christianity was the religion of my childhood, but it's also something that I came back to freely as an adult after 20-odd years of atheism, because piece by piece I found that it answers my needs and it corresponds to emotional reality for me." So for him, it was much more of an emotional pull. He found that actually the Christian faith was emotionally satisfying as well as kind of corresponding to stuff he knew in his head. And even for Josh McDowell, who's now a famous apologist and does all sorts of stuff with reason, he says that when he first became a Christian, evidence got his attention, but it was love that drew him. I think it's really interesting that the atheist church has been so successful. And I think it's proof that actually as humans we are inherently social beings. And all of us, no matter what upbringing we have, we're all longing for community. Dartmouth Medical School did a study recently which said that, well, what we all kind of know is that we're hardwired for relationships. When a child is born, they're physically, biologically, chemically designed to engage in relationships. David Kinnaman, this guy who wrote the book You Lost Me about teenagers leaving the church, said that relational alienation is one of the defining features of our culture. He tells the story of a woman called Ashley who meets a young girl on a plane, and it's only a short, it's an American sort of internal flight, it's not a long flight, and they get talking just about general life, and this girl told Ashley all about her parents' divorce. And at the end of the plane journey, this little girl said to Ashley something which nearly broke Ashley's heart. She said, "Ashley, I think you know me better than anyone else in the world." That's what we're dealing with. These young people really don't have a lot of young people don't have these good connections either with their parents or with their siblings, and actually they're desperate for loving relationships. All of our young people need someone like Ashley to share their lives with. But more importantly than that, they need to be introduced to the God who truly knows them intimately. I think a lot of our young people are drawn to Christian community because of the relationships, but whether they know it or not, what they're ultimately seeking is the most important relationship. So we need to make sure that we're gently pointing people to God. Last bit of the verse, worship Christ as Lord of your life, and if someone asks you about your Christian hope, always be ready to explain it, but do this with gentleness and respect. Everything else I've said counts for nothing if we don't pay attention to this bit. Colossians 4:6 says, let your conversation be always full of grace. It's not just what we say that's important, it's the way we say it. Gregory Kukul, that apologist, says, don't let your style get in the way of your message. At a recent atheist rally, Dawkins apparently was geeing up all of his people to mock and ridicule Christians. I think we need to do completely the opposite. We need to be gentle, we need to be respectful, and we need to be winsome. Donald Miller in Blue Like Jazz says, nobody will listen to you unless they sense that you like them. If a person senses that you do not like them, then your religion and your political ideas will all seem wrong to them. I think it's really important when we're engaging in apologetics to remember that we're not here to win arguments. We're here to point people to the cross. We need to be willing to lose an argument in order to win a person. We need to be gentle and we need to be respectful. I think we also can't underestimate the power of prayer in evangelism. Evangelism won't work unless we pray about it. David Robertson says that we can talk to people about God, but we can also talk to God about people. Sharing the gospel is our task, but it's God's problem. The missionary Father Donovan, who I started out with, says this: how liberating to know that no matter who it is that plants or who it is that waters, it is God who makes things grow. I think we often, and I certainly do, put so much pressure on myself to take someone from being a staunch atheist to being a card-carrying Christian, and we often neglect the importance of planting what is often a really significant seed. And I think what's a much more realistic option is what Gregory Kukul says in his book, Tactics. He says, I never set out to convert anyone. My aim is never to win anyone to Christ. I have a modest goal. All I want to do is put a stone in someone's shoe. I want to give him something worth thinking about, something that he can't ignore because it continues to poke at him in a good way. We have no idea what impact a tiny seed will make when the power of God gets hold of it. Of course, we should be praying for revival. Of course, we should be praying for thousands of people to come through our church doors and be radically changed. Of course, we should be praying for conversion. But we should also be praying for opportunities for us and for our congregations to put a stone in someone's shoe. I want to just finish with the words of Bishop Christopher Chesson, who's the Bishop of Southwark, and his Pentecost sermon last year was called Hearts on Fire. And in it, he kind of looked at some of the challenges that the church has been facing, and he said that doing nothing is not an option. And these are the words that he finished with, and I wonder if we want to kind of bow our heads and use this as a bit of a prayer. He says, this joy, the joy of the good news that cannot be contained and must be shared, the joy of an encounter with the risen Jesus, the joy of being a community that knows this is what I want our diocese to be. I want us to be a people so filled with the overflowing gift of the Spirit that we are compelled to serve our communities and to share our faith, and to do this with great joy and gladness.